On Monday of this week, the Pennsylvania Senate held a committee hearing featuring the CEO of Norfolk Southern, Alan Shaw. This hearing had senators from both sides of the aisle, including two folks who are the committee chairs. One of them you might be familiar with, Senator Doug Mastriano, the other, Senator Katie Muth. Both of these senators did a very good job asking some very pointed and difficult questions to Alan Shaw, much better than even what we saw in Washington, D.C. when he was testifying in front of the U.S. Senate. During this hearing, we've got everything from Alan Shaw basically trying to lay blame on the local fire chief in East Palestine for the decision that was made to do the controlled vent and burn. We also have Alan Shaw being stuck on not being able to say who was involved in that decision, who was involved in the unified command is what it's called, to ultimately make that decision. He also got some really tough questions from Senator Muth on the health fund that Norfolk Southern has set up. If everything's fine, why do you need a health fund? That's a tough question that Senator Muth asked, that we watched Alan Shaw squirm a little bit during. We also had him not being able to provide specifics on basically anything. Without further ado, though, let's get into some of these clips and actually break down everything that happened in this hearing.
And so the decision made by Unified Command under the direction of the incident commander was a controlled vent and burn.
If I could just clarify something here. So I joined the Army in the 80s. I'm an old soldier. And in that environment, we were all trained in nuclear, biological, and chemical warfare. And any chemical release was never called controlled by any of us, because there's atmospherics, of course, that weigh in and determine or direct the course these winds will blow, or the moisture air might take it. We don't control atmospheric dispersion. We could guess at it. So I can't accept any idea that any of this was controlled. Once something is set loose, it's up to the elements. But Senator Muth has a brief question.
Yeah, since you're on this line of questioning, I just need you to clarify, Mr. Shaw. You said that the incident command person was the local fire chief, correct?
The incident commander, which led Unified Command, is the local Fire Chief Drabeck. Yes, ma'am.
So the local fire chief led the entire operation on the ground, including the decision of the burn.
Senator, there were state, federal, and local authorities there as well, and he was in close contact with the governor of Ohio.
So first off there, we have Senator Mastriano pointing out, number one, that nothing about this was a controlled vent and burn, relating it to some of his history in the military. But also, I mean, you go talk to any resident, you go look at some of the drone footage that was actually exclusively provided to Status Coup by resident Corey Figley. You look at any of this, nothing about this situation was controlled. Nothing about the situation was controlled. And then you get into the beginning here of the blame game starting to begin, with fingers starting to be pointed towards the fire chief. That is about to get a whole lot worse in a second here. Let's go ahead and play that next clip.
Then the decision was made to do a vent and burn.
And once again, who was that decision made by?
By Unified Command, sir.
Who specifically in Unified Command said this is what we're going to do? You're blaming it on a chief in East Palestine at this point. Is that correct?
Senator, the Unified Command was under the leadership of the incident commander, who was in close coordination with Governor DeWine.
So your cars are on fire, it's your rail, it's your incident, and you're going to leave it to a local fire chief who probably never had to deal with potentially such a catastrophe before. And he's going to make the decision.
Senator, the Unified Command, was taking input from a number of different constituencies.
Oh, he was taking input from a number of different constituencies. One big issue that happens throughout this hearing is, on several occasions, both of these senators and others asked Alan Shaw, who were these other people in the room? And he basically was like, oh, we can provide this data to you at a later date. I don't know exactly who was there. It was a mix of state and local officials. This hearing is taking place in Pennsylvania. And at the time, it sure seems like no one from Pennsylvania was present, or barely present. You know, there might have been a phone call going back and forth. But again, this derailment happened a couple hundred feet from the state line of Pennsylvania. So it's great that Ohio, representatives may have been involved in some of the decisions here. But it really seems like Pennsylvania was not really a major part of some of the decision making here. And you'll hear that a lot of the questions kind of get framed in this way. And then, man, again, Mastriano asks, says specifically, like, you're really going to blame this on a small town fire chief who very likely doesn't have the sort of experience to deal with this sort of thing? That's not knocking the fire chief. That's just saying any small town fire chief is not going to have the training on these sorts of chemicals, these potential for explosions sending shrapnel across their towns. That's just not how these sorts of things should be working. You should be having an expert in this sort of thing calling the shots, being the incident commander, rather than leaving this at the local level to be decided. And the fact that Shaw is trying to place blame on this small town fire chief, again, most of the fire departments, volunteers. You're going to lay the blame on these volunteers, essentially, who came in to try to help, and their chief. That doesn't seem like the actual story that went on. If the fire chief was making any decisions, I'm very certain that there was an unbelievable amount of pressure being put on him by folks who knew more so what was going on. And again, as Mastriano says earlier in this, this happened on your tracks. These are your trains, your cars, and you're going to blame it on the fire chief. Not a fan of Doug Mastriano's politics at all, but he and Senator Muth here have done a very good job and are going to continue to do a good job. I'm going to show you a couple more clips here of, really showing what Alan Shaw is trying to do here.
Senator, I think it's important to note that the vent and burn worked.
It worked? Is that what you said? Sorry, I just didn't hear you.
Yes. The air testing throughout the process indicated by the EPA, by the Ohio EPA, and by the Pennsylvania Department of Environmental Protection notes that the air is clean. Water testing notes that the water is safe. We avoided the potential for a catastrophic, uncontrolled explosion that would have potentially shot harmful gas and shrapnel throughout the community.
So the bulk of the testing that I'm aware of occurred after the burn. So was there any in real-time testing of any human lungs or air quality in any of these people's houses, some of which were told to shelter in place while they watched a giant orange eruption above their home? Was there air testing done during the burn while these people were sitting inside of their homes?
Yes, Senator. Air testing was in place shortly after the derailment, and air testing indicates that the air quality was safe throughout the community during the vent and burn, before, during, and after.
So there's data that shows post-derailment but pre-burn air quality, I'm guessing, right? So there should be levels before the burn. Then there should be data that's during the burn and after. Does that data exist somewhere?
Senator, yes, that's my understanding. And the data shows that in the community, outside of the evacuation zone, the air was safe.
So we, as a committee, have none of that data, so it's very difficult for us. I mean, I would say that to anyone. It's no personal offense to you. It just, in the absence of having reports and numbers and data, it's really difficult, especially based on symptoms reported by those who live in that community, that, if people had rashes and can't breathe and are having respiratory distress, I would argue that, and if you weren't real-time monitoring in their homes or around their homes during this burn, I don't know how anyone can say that it worked or that no harm was done. Because if you're burning off things during that burn, you could argue the highest contaminant level would be during the burn.
Senator, I'm very sorry for the impact that this has had on the community. And I do understand that some of the citizens have developed symptoms with which they're not comfortable or.
It's okay, guys. Alan Shaw is sorry. I hope you all accept his apology and we can all just move on from this. He's sorry. He's sorry that his train exploded in this small town and was set on fire. He's sorry that, all of these people are having all sorts of health implications. He's sorry that down the line, a lot of these people very well could end up with cancers and all sorts of other things, given the fact that these were carcinogens on the train, as well as carcinogens that are created when this stuff was set on fire. But Alan Shaw is sorry, everybody. So we can all just pack up our bags, move on. I don't need to cover this story anymore. Ridiculous. I mean, he's saying the air quality was safe through the whole thing. that everybody should just be like, yep, the air quality is safe. Then why are these people all getting sick? Why are they getting sick? It doesn't make any sense. And why hasn't all of that information been released of the air quality during the burn? Even he's saying that that's all there. Where's the information from that? Were they testing the air quality over the state line in Pennsylvania, where a lot of this blew? I mean, I've talked to residents in Pennsylvania who live 7 miles away, 4 miles away, several of them, and this plume went up in the air and right over, and in some cases into their properties. I mean, it's hilly terrain. Some of this stuff lands in their properties. Were they doing air testing at their houses? And they claim that they were doing, she asked about residential air testing. They didn't test the insides of these folks' homes until they were already back in town. And the air tests that were done inside of these people's homes was done very quickly with devices that can't test for all of these different chemicals at once. We've talked a little bit about this on the channel, but if you're using a PID detector and you're doing these broad VOC tests, sure, you can test broadly for VOCs, volatile organic compounds, but that doesn't mean that you can also test for all of the different chemical byproducts of vinyl chloride. I'll name a couple of them right now. When you burn vinyl chloride, some of the byproducts include hydrogen chloride. They include phosgene. They include formaldehyde. You can't test for formaldehyde while also broadly testing for VOCs. You can't do it. You need a special attachment. I've talked to chemists, I've talked to toxicologists about this. You can't test for both of these things at once. And with many of these chemicals, except for one, with many of these chemicals, if you can smell it, it's already a level of concern. It's already a level of concern. We're going to continue on with the hearing here.
And so is the Family Assistance Center set up to ease community anxiety? Because if you're saying there's nothing wrong, there was no contamination or harm done, that was actually, you led me into my next question, was even the health compensation fund, why is it necessary if no one was poisoned?
Senator, the Family Assistance Center was set up within 24 hours of the derailment to help folks with recovery assistance, to help folks who were impacted by it, whether that's they needed to evacuate and they had expenses associated with that. It was also to help folks who may have just had inconvenience or been impacted. And it was also designed to provide folks with information. The testing by the air and the water is done by trusted government agencies, the EPA and the Ohio EPA and the Pennsylvania Department of Environmental Protection.
First off, that's not entirely true, especially in the very beginning. The vast majority of the testing done was by contractors that were literally hired out by the railroad. This company, CTEH, that you've heard us talk quite a bit about. CTEH has a troubling history, to say the least. They're oftentimes hired by big corporations like Norfolk Southern after they make a big mess to come in and give the appearance that everything is fine, to run tests for things that they know that they're not going to find, and tell people, look, everything's fine. We're getting these, they're doing these very broad tests and we're not finding anything, trying to put people's minds at ease. But Senator Muth there asks the question very pointedly, if everything's fine, why is the Assistance Center set up to, hopefully pay for these people's medical bills? First off, I actually haven't heard from a resident who has had their medical bills paid for by Norfolk Southern. I've heard in some cases Norfolk Southern asking, oh, do you have insurance for people who ended up in the hospital? But I have not spoken with a resident who has been reimbursed for healthcare bills as a result of this to date. That does not mean that it doesn't exist, but I've talked to a hell of a lot of people in East Palestine at that point, and I think they would have told me if that was the case. And I've asked about these sorts of things before. So I am not convinced that healthcare bills have been paid for or will be paid for in the future here. And then we've got one more clip we're going to play here that also really hits the point home about, Shaw is trying to say, these are trusted agencies who are performing a lot of the tests going here. They're very trusted agencies. You all should just believe everything that they're saying to you. Let's go ahead and hear what Senator Muth had to say about that.
So the long-term water testing, how long is that? What is long-term in Norfolk Southern's operational definition? And then also the health compensation fund, what does that cover and who's eligible and what does that entail?
Senator, I'll note that it's also the EPA and Ohio EPA and the Pennsylvania DEP who are doing the testing as well.
Unfortunately, all three of them have lied about water testing before, so, but go ahead. Not my opinion, unfortunately, just the reality of historical government failure.
Whew, that was, I mean, again, you've heard this from me before. You've definitely heard this from Jordan before. Unfortunately, a lot of these agencies have a track record of things going wrong, and it's not speculation. As Senator Muth there says, it's fact. And with all of this going on, and with the coverage of East Palestine unfortunately wavering away by most media outlets, us not included, fortunately, but you know, the media is mostly out of town, and there are now reports kind of going out that they're trying to make East Palestine and the symptoms and some of the stuff that's being described as Russian misinformation now. There was just an article from the AP that came out yesterday, essentially trying to tie a lot of the people kind of questioning some of these things to Russian misinformation. I'm sorry, but East Palestine is still messed up. There, no Russian misinformation is, you know, in my eyeballs for what I actually went and saw and heard with my own eyes. There's no Russian misinformation in me actually feeling some of these symptoms myself in person while I was there last week. Okay. So the fact that a lot of these folks now are starting to twist into these weird rabbit holes that we've seen happen before. I mean, how much of the Russia stuff was proved wrong the first, you know, the last, I won't even say the first time anymore. There's been so many things. Oh, we'll just blame that on the Russians. We'll just blame that on the Russians. And they're saying that, you know, anything that's making the situation in East Palestine look bad, because it is bad, is anti-American propaganda. That is absolutely insane to me. It drove me nuts when I saw that last night, because this is like the first example of, I was actually there last week. I was there a couple of weeks before that as well. The situation that these people are going through is very real. It's very serious. And unfortunately, our government is not treating it that way. The fact that these people are still needing to go directly to the railroad to beg for their help, rather than having, you know, assistance coming from the government and taking out that step of them needing to go beg for money to relocate, is absolutely egregious. We should all be ashamed of ourselves, frankly, that that's the way that our government is currently handling the situation in East Palestine. We're going to be staying on this story, continuing with it. I'll likely be back in East Palestine again in a couple weeks. We've got Jordan actually planning on getting back to Flint in a couple weeks as well. We're also going to be staying on top of all sorts of other news that's going to be breaking. Please, if you're not already subscribed to us, please hit the subscribe button down below. If you want to follow me on Twitter, I am at LewisD217. Thank you all so much for watching, and have a great day.